In Articles 9 through 13, we dealt with the means by which God's grace is provided through the Word and Sacrament. In this episode, we take up Articles 14 and 15, which are the articles that address the administration of the means of grace, by talking about who administers the means of grace and what rites are proper for the administration of the sacraments.
With that in mind, let's begin by looking at Article 14, which addresses the issue of who has the right to preach publicly. A couple of points before we look at the content of the article and its significance. To begin with, it's the shortest of all the articles, one sentence. The brevity is likely tied to a second interesting historical observation. While most of the other articles in the Augsburg Confession have some relationship to previous documents written by the confessors, this article has no parallel article in the Schwabach or Marburg articles.
Right. Melanchthon was likely motivated to write this article as a response to Johann Eck's attack in the 404 articles. In those articles, Eck had listed the Lutheran rejection of the sacrament of ordination and the teaching of the royal priesthood as heresies. And remember, the penalty for heresy at that time was death. So, this was a very serious matter indeed.
So Eck, in attacking Luther's understanding of the royal priesthood, was clearly referring to what Luther had written in the address to the Christian nobility and in the Babylonian captivity. In the Christian nobility, Luther placed the ultimate authority to both call and remove priests from ministry on the shoulders of the congregation. To be sure, Luther recognized the value of having good order, which meant an orderly call process governed by and within an institution. But he also recognized that in emergency situations, the congregation must go outside of the regular process and call a pastor themselves.
Luther's main point here is that while there is value in good church order when it comes to calling a pastor, the congregation, as an assembly of priests, has the right, if not the duty, to intervene if the gospel is oppressed, either by the authorities who possess the right to call or by the congregation's pastor. Let's pause a moment to think about the impact of what Luther was saying.
Yeah, because this is something that catches a lot of congregation members today by surprise. Luther was saying that when it comes to matters of the gospel, Christ's forgiveness being suppressed or abused, then the congregation must intervene. And it doesn't matter if that suppression is coming from the bishop or other church authorities, or from the pastor himself or herself. This is a matter of pastoral care of souls, and salvation itself is at stake.
With that being said, however, Luther did still consider it desirable for the bishop to exercise the right to call as a representative of the calling church. He did this because he recognized that the bishop would not be functioning as a superior who was exercising special authority by virtue of his ordination, but rather as a servant who has the duty of exercising the church's right to call.
So as a sidebar, you can see why Lutheran denominations over the years have instituted an office that they've labeled as a district president or a synod bishop. The responsibilities of these offices are so that the congregations can have some assurance that the preachers in the pulpits have a proper understanding of the preaching of the word and administration of the sacraments. But at the same time, Luther and the other confessors knew all too well that the people placed in these offices were not beyond causing problems in their own right.
This is seen in the events that played out in Luther's lifetime. In the 1520s, the bishops were opposing the proclamation of the gospel, so congregations did intervene and assume the authority to call their pastors and ordain them for that matter. In To the Christian Nobility, Luther rejected the idea that ordination is absolutely necessary for ministry, although the congregation's call to ministry certainly is necessary. Ordination, according to Luther, is simply the choosing of one believer out of the priesthood of believers who will perform ministry functions in that congregation. In other words, there is no special character or power given in ordination, so of course the congregation can ordain someone just as they can call someone to be their pastor.
In the Babylonian captivity, Luther expands on this idea by asserting that ordination is not a sacrament. Instead, it's simply a rite by which the church chooses and calls its pastors. And ordination does not confer a special character, or anything else for that matter, other than the identification of the pastor's role in the congregation. That means that when an ordained pastor retires or is no longer a pastor, then he or she is like any other layperson. In other words, to be a pastor is simply to exercise a specific office, the office of proclaiming the word and administering the sacraments. That's it.
Melanchthon's apology makes it clear that he's saying nothing different here than did Luther when it comes to the call to ministry and the congregation's duties in these matters. But remember, the political stakes and the pressures on the confessors and how it impacted the document.
Right. It's equally clear that by avoiding naming these things specifically, and thus invoking Luther's understanding of the royal priesthood and what the role of a pastor is and is not, Melanchthon was able to avoid the label of heresy. The language he used in Article 14 was both concise enough and vague enough, actually, that the computation approved it with the understanding that regularly called means called in accordance with ecclesiastical ordinances.
That language in the confutation actually compelled Melanchthon to be a little clearer in the apology. And so, it's in the apology that he states that the Lutherans desire the existing church structure, including the hierarchy, be maintained, and here's the key, in accordance with the ancient canons. In other words, Melanchthon aligns the confessors with the ancient canons and church fathers, and in so doing, he says that it's the Roman Catholic bishops who are to blame for persecuting the church and oppressing the gospel.
And that's a bold move for Melanchthon. And he goes on to say in the Apology to Article 14 that the confessors have clear consciences in all of these matters because they understand that it's the Roman Catholics who've walked away from the early church fathers and canons. Thus, any church split is at the hands of the Roman Catholic theologians, not the confessors.
We'll talk more about the specifics of priests with respect to marriage in Article 23 and the role of bishops in Article 28. But for now, we want you to remember that the confessors did not believe they were doing or saying anything new with regard to their understanding of the call to ministry, or even with the role of bishops. Rather, they believed the Roman Catholic Church had strayed from the early church canons and church fathers. Let's look at Article 15 now on ecclesiastical rites. The article is divided into 3 parts. The first part maintains that the existing rites should be maintained as long as they don't conflict with the gospel and they contribute to peace and good order in the church. Melanchthon specifically mentions holy days and festivals here. The second part consists of an admonition not to burden consciences. For example, when traditional rites of the church are considered necessary for salvation. And the third part of Article 15 is a rejection of traditions such as monastic vows and fasting regulations, which are actually opposed to the gospel.
Now, the critical question here is, how are these things opposed to the gospel? Well, they're opposed to the gospel because their purpose is to earn grace as a substance and to make satisfaction for sin. In other words, they leave Christ off to the side. You should recognize once again how the definition of grace is pivotal in all these issues. We'll talk more about things like the human traditions the Roman Catholic Church has turned into requirements, things such as the law of fasting in Article 26. But for now, we want you to note again that the confessors are maintaining in this article, as they did in Article 14 and elsewhere, that it's the Lutherans who are being consistent with the early church fathers and canons. In fact, in the Apology, Melanchthon goes so far as to say that the Lutheran churches keep the canonical regulations better than do the Roman Catholic churches. For an example, he points to the fact that the Lord's Supper is administered and received by many in Lutheran churches, while the Mass is being abused for the sake of profit in Roman Catholic churches.
As we wrap up this episode, it's helpful to talk a bit about the ramifications of this article on matters that are not explicitly addressed by the language of the article itself. We do this for 2 reasons. In a later episode, we will address a controversy called the adiaphora controversy, in which Lutherans are arguing amongst themselves about some of these matters. The second reason is to see how the principles rooted in this article inform day-to-day issues in the local congregation. In this context, a relevant topic to take up, although it's one not addressed specifically in the Augsburg Confession, is the specific content of the worship service.
The first thing to notice is that Luther was actually not prescriptive in these matters. In other words, he wrote on the worship service in an advisory manner only. And when advising congregations about worship, Luther took the same approach as did Melanchthon in the Augsburg Confession. Retain the tradition as much as possible, but not at the expense of the gospel. When it came to matters of the worship service, Luther and his fellow reformers fought two fronts, Zwingli and the enthusiasts, and the Romanists, both of which were doing the same thing, actually. They were making worship a matter of the law, either requiring the use of the liturgical tradition or abolishing that liturgical tradition entirely. Luther recognized that both parties were caught in the law, and they both lost the freedom of the gospel.
So, how does this inform today's parish practice? We see a similar thing in what is sometimes called the worship wars. One side makes the traditions into a law, and the other side makes the abolition of all liturgical traditions into a law. And what's lost is the gospel proclamation as people fight about who's right and who's wrong. Luther and his fellow confessors recognized the value of church traditions, but they did so by recognizing that their chief importance was actually in their teaching function or in their catechetical function. There is no question that Luther himself preferred to hold to the church tradition wherever possible, but he did so as a matter of preference and not as a matter of prescription or law. Therefore, in matters of ecclesiastical rites or oversight, the local congregation must be keen in observing what best serves the true administration of the Word and its sacraments and what hinders it. And this is not something to take lightly. The care of souls is at stake.